Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Can, Head of Mining Journal Research, and this is one of 3 online discussions we're running as part of our stakeholder engagement program. It's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists for this session. We've got Lucy Crane, who's wearing a few hats for us today. She's Women in Mining on the executive committee there. She's with the Young Mining Professionals on the committee there, and is also a senior geologist with Cornish Lithium. We've got Leif Carroll, who's the Mining Lead Applied Intelligence with Accenture. We have Aidan Davey, Chief Operating Officer for the International Council on Mining and Metals, and also Dr. Alan Knight with ArcelorMittal, General Manager for Sustainable Development and Corporate Responsibility and Responsible Steel Co-Chairman. Welcome everybody, and thanks very much for taking the time to join us. Aidan, I might come straight to you. One of the things that came out of the work we've done so far in terms of how the industry is engaging with its stakeholders at the moment was a huge number of standards that are out in the industry at the moment. I think we counted more than 40. The ICMM has released an updated set of its own mining principles, and you've talked previously about pulling a lot of these standards together to get some agreement. So mining companies are clearer on what they need to be reporting on and the best practice they need to be adhering to. And then also, so stakeholders can get a better idea of what they're looking at. Can you give us an idea of where you are in that amalgamation or aggregation process? And if you've set any timelines in terms of getting something a bit more concrete in place for the industry?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And look, just to be very, very clear, there is no grand ambition on the part of ICMM or an agenda to try and force convergence or aggregation across the various standards and initiatives within this space. But I do think there is certainly a role for us and others who are active in this area to try and give a greater level of transparency and create an understanding out there about what are the similarities and what are the differences between these things. And again, if you think back to what's driving all of this, you know, as consumer and stakeholder concerns over the provenance and means of production of metals and minerals have increased, the industry has responded, and it's through a range of initiatives that establish performance requirements for the responsible production of metals and minerals. You know, some of those are commodity specific, some are cross commodity, some involve certification, some don't. But I think one of the things that's, you know, pretty much common across all of them, notwithstanding the differences, is they're all focused on improved ESG practices at the operational level. That's universal. And so then downstream customers ultimately have to make an informed choice about which of the various standards or initiatives are comprehensive in terms of, you know, the issues of concern that they're going to cover, but also credible through being supported by robust third-party oversight. And as the owners of one of these, as the owners of mining principles, we feel an obligation to be transparent with downstream customers about the extent to which you know, what we're doing is equivalent to other standards and initiatives, while highlighting any important points of difference or divergence. And so to that end, we're actively engaging with many owners of the other initiatives and standards to assess equivalency and agree on points of divergence. I think when we maybe spoke back in the beginning of this year, just before lockdown started, that was just getting off, just underway. And we're now at a stage where we're expecting to release the first 4 of these next month. And that's with the World Gold Council's Responsible Gold Mining Principles, with the Risk Readiness Assessment of the Responsible Minerals Initiative, the Copper Mark, and with 1 or 2 others. And ultimately, what we want to do is to make this information publicly available, very much with the support of the other standards and initiatives, and it includes Mining Associations of Canada's Towards Sustainable Mining. And the aim is very much to increase transparency. It's also to avoid the additional administrative burden for member companies and other companies, and indeed downstream customers that are participating in other recognized third-party validation systems, by giving cross-recognition where appropriate. So things have definitely moved on from where we spoke last on this, Chris, and we're in active discussion with the owners of at least a half a dozen other schemes, including the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, to make sure that we have that common agreed position of points of difference and points of similarity.
Okay, I mean, so would the practical view be then, if you've got 4 agreements in place at the moment, or 4 understandings in place at the moment, however you want to describe it, with different groups, you've got another 6 that you're working on. Eventually, groups that aren't able to come in and show where they're aligned and where they're divergent, they'll potentially drop away and start to streamline the landscape for companies to some extent. Would that be what we're shooting for?
Not necessarily. And again, I come back to the point that the genesis of these things, there's always a reason, and there's always a set of stakeholders who find them of value and of importance. And so I think what we'll find is, as other schemes come on stream, as long as they have a perceived value amongst their stakeholders, and that may be amongst NGOs, it may be amongst customers, it may be investors or others, but as long as there's a perceived value there, and as long as there's uptake and application, particularly by our member companies, we would simply want to go down the route of doing an equivalency assessment.
Okay.
I do think that one of the things that those equivalency assessments will ultimately help to drive is a degree of convergence. And so as you get to a point where the standards are coming up for review, and that would include for us, we will be taking a very close look at points of divergence with some of the other schemes and going, is this a gap that it's important to close? But I do think that, to your point about, well, there is absolutely no hidden agenda here or ambition on our part to see some of the other schemes, as it were, fade away into obscurity. I do think it will become more and more important for schemes that are coming into this space to be able to demonstrate, how do we align with, or how are we different to other things, and what's the value proposition as well of having this as opposed to some of those other initiatives that are already out there and more established.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm attempting to accuse the ICMM of having an ulterior motive here, Aidan. I think it's actually more the other way. I think the industry, from the conversations that we've had, they would very much like to see someone grab a lot of these standards and these guidelines and put them together, so it's a lot more straightforward. So yeah, there's no intention there to suggest that you're performing outside your remit. I think it's probably been driven from industry, if anything else. Alan, listening to the process the ICMM is going through, they're being aware of the number of different standards that are out there and guidelines, and then based on your previous experience in the forestry sector with certification, obviously you're also working with IRMA as well. How do you see the progression from where we are at the moment to certification, or do you not see it necessarily going down that road or that far?
Yeah, it's interesting with all this conversation about, mutual recognition and coming together, because also I have to look at it as a company who buys raw materials as well as having its own mine sites. So it's, of all the schemes out there, which ones do we prefer and why? So there's always this slight tension as to how similar are these schemes, to where are they different, and of those differences, which ones do we value the most and value the least? So there's always that sort of creative tension between being the same deliberately and being different deliberately. So when you sort of go down the sort of the thinking of what do you prefer, what are you looking for from a scheme, and what I learned from the forestry sector were sort of 3 very fundamental principles served the industry well and served the customer well. Truly multi-stakeholder. Actually, and by stakeholders, I mean not just being consulted, but involved in the decision-making process. They own the organization as much as the value chain. Site-based, something which talks about the corporate without actually reaching the site you're buying from, doesn't really help in the long term. And then independent certification. So multi-stakeholder, site-based, and independent certification. And when you sort of apply that preference filter, let's say, to all the different schemes, it's logical that you end up favouring something like IRMA because it ticks all those boxes. That's not to say the other schemes are bad. That's not to say the other schemes aren't as good and that the standards are as robust. It's, I only have to choose one of all the ones I need to choose. Which one do I prefer? And then which ones of the other schemes which don't meet my preference criteria are suitable anyway. So I'm not sort of saying it's black and white that it's only IRMA. We're also very close to TSM. I think Better Coal's interesting. And we know that some of our suppliers will have their own preferences too. But at the end of the day, it's easier for us to ask for less than ask for more. And therefore we have to share with our stakeholders what do we prefer. And we prefer the multi-stakeholder IRMA model, which is why we are members, why we sit on the board, why we're discussing with our suppliers what their views are, and why for the mine sites we operate, we've already started the IRMA process. And Responsible Steel has the same challenge as well. On what criteria does it decide which schemes are preferred by Responsible Steel and which ones don't quite meet those criteria? So yes, the closer these different schemes are, great, but as long as they meet the preference criteria too. What do we need and what do we prefer?
Okay, a certification, just to be clear, a certification is a higher standard than a lot of the guidelines and the different standards that we're talking about that are elsewhere in the industry. The certification is site level, third party verification or assessment. Is that accurate?
So for me, what I've learned through the work I do with forestry is that the standards are important, but the standards aren't the only thing. The process by which people agree those standards, the governance of the standards, there are sensitivities there. And as you say, the certification aspect, what is the proof that you actually do meet the guidelines or the standards? And what we say is site-based independent certification is a thorough way of proving that you meet the standard. So how do you agree the standard? What actually is the standard itself? And how do you prove that you're meeting the standard? That trilogy matters as much as just the standard itself.
Okay. Aidan, you mean you're in the process, you're having to look through so many different standards and guidelines at the moment with the work you're doing. What's the variance in these standards at the moment? And do you see the natural progression towards something like what Alan's saying, or do you think that the industry is okay without that level of rigor?
So it's interesting when I hear Alan talk about the holy trinity of multi-stakeholder site-based independent certification. I guess I would have a slightly different take on that. And full disclosure, perhaps I might insist on having a slightly different take on that because we don't have a multi-stakeholder model at the heart of the ICMM's governance. But I think what matters is that whether you are multi-stakeholder or not, that the standards at their core are regarded as credible and robust by a multi-stakeholder audience. So the conduit for getting there, I think, matters less. And I say this because, quite crudely put, when I look at the benchmarks we've been doing against some of the other multi-stakeholder processes that are out there, objectively, the ICMM's mining principles set a slightly higher bar of performance in a number of areas. That's not a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying that the outcome of a multi-stakeholder process doesn't necessarily take you to a point where you've got a higher standard of performance that's being expected. Where I absolutely agree with Alan, though, is that so you need something that's robust. You need something that's site-based. 100%. The days where you were looking at corporate level disclosures of aggregate information to give sufficient confidence to downstream customers, investors, and crucially other stakeholders, I think they're past. So completely agree on the site-based. I disagree on independent certification, though. I agree with Alan about independent third-party oversight and third-party validation. But certification is just one of a number of different options that you have. So you can have third-party assurance, which is the model we favor, versus third-party certification. Certification ultimately is very, very often used in situations where companies make a commercial decision around adherence or application. And so those schemes which have gone down the certification route, ultimately, there's a commercial decision to be made by implementing companies. Do we want to do this or don't we want to do this? Whereas if you're an ICMM member or if you're a Mining Association of Canada member, you don't get to choose. It's a condition of membership. And you don't get to pick and choose which assets within your portfolio you're going to do it at. So a certification model there doesn't become particularly useful or important. What's much more important to us is that they're doing it across all the assets. And so we're looking at, our 27 members having over 650 assets. This is going to apply to over 50 countries. So we want this thing to be taken to scale. So broadly agree with you, Alan, in terms of the robustness of what's at the core of this. How you get there, I have a different view. And third party, absolutely, but not necessarily certification.
Alan, from the perspective of someone buying materials, does that make sense to you? I mean, you're saying you prefer the IRMA model, but when you're looking at whether you've ticked the boxes for as a steel producer, are you happy with that, with those standards and the levels of assurance that Aidan's talking about?
So that's why I use the word preference. It's, you can always disagree on that. You're never going to have full alignment. If we did, we would have done this 20 years ago. It's just based on what other sectors have done and what they've achieved. Because I was involved in forestry, what I learned from that was it was easier to get stakeholders to buy into what you're doing if the governance model allows them to be involved in it, hence the word preference. What we finally end up agreeing on, or actually, as Aidan says, Holdme has to defend on the performance of it. But at the moment, we're putting a lot of our eggs in the models I've suggested because we prefer them. We think they achieve more, they create greater level of security. And the other thing as well is because we have to look for schemes which can be used by mining companies who aren't members of ICMM. So if you're in that, it might be that if you're under that umbrella and you're following the ICMM model, maybe we will end up being more pragmatic because of the performance aspects. So we're not as distant. This isn't us versus them. It's just we prefer the extra bells and whistles I've added because they've proven themselves in other sectors. The forestry sector did have its own standard and it wasn't as successful as FSC, full stop. So it's natural as a buyer that we prefer the models which have proven themselves in other sectors. I'm not sure what's wrong with that. Yeah. And if some of our mining companies choose to go down the same route, then better still. We'll have more IRMA than other stuff. So I think we're still open-minded, but I'm very comfortable why we prefer the models we do.
Okay. Leif, if I can get you to unmute yourself for a second.
Sure.
Accenture works with a lot of large companies, I guess mid-tiers through to large companies mainly, where it feels like regardless of which path we go down and where we end up eventually, or where we're going to end up eventually, is at a much higher standard than we have been working to. That feels inevitable. How well equipped are mining groups that you work with to start delivering on higher levels of performance, reporting those levels of performance from a site level across a portfolio? What do they need to do if they're not quite there to get there?
Well, many have already started down that path. And it's been interesting listening to Aidan and Alan, because part of that is starting to be, or increasingly being driven by consumer behaviour, and causing the upstream segment of the value chain of our industry, if you think of the whole mining industry being metals and mining, to behave differently, as well as, of course, the behaviour and the drive from the institutional investors to address things in a different way, to improve stakeholder engagement, to flagging that climate change is a very high priority, along with other ESG elements. And the pandemic has been a huge catalyst in as Lucy was saying earlier on before the call, in pushing everyone towards more digital working. It actually has been a huge catalyst in moving our mining companies to increasing their access to digital data, particularly that situational awareness data. Because when the pandemic first started, that was key. Everyone needed to know what was going on immediately, whether that be about the workforce specifically in terms of health and safety, but also about their supply chain. And clearly there was massive disruption early on, and there is some ongoing in the supply chain as a whole. So the mining companies were already on the path to getting access to the right data in an operational space to be able to be transparent about the various ESG metrics, but that has increased hugely in the last 10 months or so. A lot of their activities now are focused on capturing the right data, but then also generating those insights that can be disclosed more widely and reported according to various standards and meeting certain targets such as the Paris Agreement.
So does it feel to you like a lot of the challenge around ESG performance is how it's reported and having access to the right data and knowing how to report that performance and that data?
To me, it feels, and I'm not speaking on behalf of any of our clients, to me it feels like the difficulty is knowing what to report on. It is possible to access that data, and that is as we get better digital tools in place, you've got near real-time data on many things, you're more engaged with your community and your workforce and other stakeholders, you have access to that information. But actually what information is of interest to external stakeholders, what information will meet the various different standards and the parameters set out in those standards. So I think the data is there, and it's actually knowing in what format that should be shared. Is it most effective to be shared? And that's not just about what's happening on the ground, or not targets what's happening on the ground, but also reporting progress improvements is key. And all of that is possible, but actually I think there are differing approaches in different companies because everybody's not following the same standard or reporting to the same organisations.
Okay, so what's happening at the moment in a typical miner that you're working with? Are people providing different stakeholder reports to different stakeholders, or are they producing one massive stakeholder report for all their stakeholders that covers absolutely everything, or is it a mishmash?
I would say we've certainly moved away from the old format of corporate social responsibility reporting as a one lump report, and it's becoming much more tailored according to stakeholder. But there is that you want to avoid the slicing data in a certain way to meet the requirements of a certain stakeholder. You have to be transparent across the board, and all stakeholders, obviously they will have their particular priorities, but actually all stakeholders seem to have the similar priorities that are based around safety, of course, climate change and the environmental management in the immediate vicinity of the operation, but also more broadly by the company, and feeding that into obviously strategy for circular economy, and then the key social issues. So it's important that it's tailored to the stakeholder, but actually not so much so that the data is being sliced in a certain way to speak only to that specific stakeholder. You're keeping that transparency across the board.
Okay. Alan, how important is that as an intermediary or as a user? How important is just to have that clarity of reporting? When you say you prefer it, is that the key reason? Obviously, it meets your standards, but is it you like to have a certification or a scheme that you choose because you get used to consuming the information in that way? You don't have to deal with so many other different types of data sets and reports.
One of the advantages of a certification model and standards is there's a very clear understanding of what good performance is. I remember being involved in the drafting of the IRMA standard for water. And of course, so suspended solids is a really good example of what would be a straightforward KPI. And of course, the conversation was, well, for some rivers in Canada going over the geological shields, the water is crystalline clear. So one part per million from the mine is probably not brilliant. You go to a tropical rainforest in the middle of Brazil, it's a very muddy river. So for me, just knowing what the suspended solids looks like like, and that's just one example, versus what's good is very hard. So whilst the company needs to have good ESG data, how can the customer at the other end know the context to see if that is that good or not? And again, so, you know, a standard is important to make that judgment. And then you start realizing that actually a field-based audit where somebody's looking around, kicking the tires, actually you can really get that sense of context. So I don't know what to do. And surely the mining sector would get worried if I was defining what's good and bad based on a database of numbers. So there is another side to this, which is, as a buyer, all I want to know is this good and is there no bad? How do you do that from numbers alone without understanding the context of different regions and different mines?
Okay. Aidan, I noticed you're jotting a few notes down there. Anything to throw in at this point? I guess mainly you're working towards trying to help companies report in a more consistent way. How that seems practically, listening to all this, that seems practically really, really difficult.
Well, yes and no, and I think Alan raises a really important point about context being so important, particularly when it comes down to some of those individual data points. And so I think there's a distinction to be made here between reporting on aggregate at the corporate level, which I think has still got a value and a purpose, and to what you achieve through site-based certification in the case of IRMA, or site-based assurance in the case of, say, ICMM's mining principles, which essentially tells you about the quality of management at the asset level. And I do think that, you know, investors in particular, but other stakeholders ought to be as concerned, if not more concerned, about quality of management as they are about the data that comes out in the the annual sustainability reports, which I think still has a value. And but it's interesting if you talk about the annual sustainability reports, and there was a great statement that came out last month from some of the major kind of schemes in this space: GRI, CDP, IRC, SASB, and one other, I think, and talking about working together towards comprehensive corporate reporting. And that's an important milestone. And what they're looking to do is to come up with joint guidance and applying their own standards and approaches in a complementary manner, a joint vision of how that would complement financial generally accepted accounting principles as a point of progress towards more consistent, comprehensive sustainability reporting. And they also signal their joint commitment to deeper collaboration in pursuit of all that. What's really interesting to me about this is this was facilitated by the World Economic Forum, but in the same month, the World Economic Forum put out a paper on measuring stakeholder capitalism towards common metrics. And that was produced in collaboration with the Big Four accounting firms. The outcome of that work recommended 21 core and 34 expanded metrics and disclosures, which the project basically recommended to companies, which kind of suggests that WEF have jumped the gun on this collaborative effort that the other 5 organizations are anticipating around a convergence of corporate level sustainability reporting. But we kind of see standardized ESG reporting in a matter of few years as being possible, but it's got to be in a sector by sector basis, otherwise it has no meaning. And the other reality is that the individual organizations that are active in this space, they're going to want to have a continued and a distinctive role for their own organization, which might inhibit progress in this space. But even if you don't get convergence, it's only part of the challenge. And I think that's the issue that Alan was talking about, is you need something which takes you beyond aggregate level information and makes it relatable to quality of management at the asset level.
Okay. Lucy, a lot of the conversations that we're having at the moment, we're talking about things happening, we're talking about mine sites, basically. As we all know, a huge proportion of the mining sector or the resources sector don't have any mines. What does it all sound like to you in terms of the reporting standards and the practices, and what you see out there in terms of what a junior company should be reporting on and should be adhering to in terms of standards, and then what's possible from an administrative perspective, given that juniors are small companies?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point, because it's fantastic that the bigger companies with big projects and big budgets are being held to certain standards and have to prove and have third-party verification that they are meeting these standards. But so much of the mining industry is small junior companies. They are often the first people on the ground going out and doing exploration, so actually can set the tone for whether that project will ever be developed or not. And a lot of them are private as well, so aren't necessarily held to account on, you know, or have to report certain things to their shareholders even. So I think it's great that it's kind of being led from the top, and that these big companies are going through this reform, and that there are so many initiatives out there. But we also need to kind of find a way to make that trickle down more rapidly to the junior space. So Cornish Lithium is an early stage exploration company in Cornwall. I think, Alan, I believe you've worked down here before. But, you know, and Cornwall's got this amazing mining heritage. So we're very lucky that the local community understand what mining is, understand the positive economic and social impact the mines had down here when they were operating. Because, you know, the economy down here is so focused on tourism now that actually if we can have some kind of primary industry, it will really help. So there's not really a very set toolkit for us to follow. And as all of the conversations so far have said, it is context specific. So trying to set up a mining industry in Cornwall is very different to the example of the potash in the national park that's now Anglo's project that we were talking about earlier. So I still think there's a lot of work to do on that. There was actually a really interesting report that came out quite recently by Swan Global, which is looking at the composition of boards in the mining industry for London Stock Exchange and AIM listed companies. And of all of the companies listed, there are only 35 professionals with expertise in health, safety, environmental, social, and community across the entire listed companies. And so, although it sounds like we're having a lot of conversations about what this should look like, there's a question around, are companies actually committing to driving these changes, or how much of it do you think is still lip service?
Okay, that for me, that sounds surprising. I did actually think we were past all the lip service stage. Obviously not. Really keen to try and get a couple of milestones down out of you guys today. So not necessarily what your specific organisations are driving at and what your targets are, but just a more general where you would like to see the industry in terms of a set of standards or guidelines and how it reports on those. Just some very basic milestones if they are, and what kind of timelines are we looking at? If we said 24 months from now, where would we like to be as an industry? What would it broadly look like for you? And perhaps, Aidan, I can round back on you at the top there and put you in the hot seats first.
Yeah, so I think within a couple of years, I think we probably will find ourselves in a situation where, and recognizing these two different levels, corporate level sustainability reporting versus asset by asset level disclosures that give insight into the quality of management at the asset level. So on the second of those, I think within a couple of years, we could expect to be in a situation where we have a increasing level of distinction between what are the schemes in this space that are regarded as credible. And when I say regarded as credible, that's not, ICMM telling the world we're great or IRMA telling the world we're great. That's external stakeholders saying, we think that this particular standard and the infrastructure that surrounds it has a value, and we're prepared to kind of take that. And so I think that's not an unrealistic position to be in, because within the space that we operate within, there are a number of scheme standards that, for example, don't have any third-party certification or validation associated with them. I think that's probably going to become an untenable position. There are a number of these schemes that don't really touch down to the asset level in a meaningful way. I don't think that's going to become tenable. And there's a number of these schemes where the disclosures associated with the outcome of any of that work that's being done at the asset level are slim to non-existent, and I don't think that is going to become tenable either. So I think either you will see an evolution and a convergence around those particular kind of attributes within those other schemes, or you will probably see a flight to quality, and some of them may well drop away. So that I think isn't unrealistic to see happening over the next couple of years. I think the other thing at that corporate level, so it is a fertile space, as I mentioned. There's the work that WEF and the Big Four have recently released that I think is going to get some attention and some traction. There's the commitment, just the symbolic commitment by those 5 reporting organizations I mentioned to collaborate, signals in some respects that they are coming under pressure to come up with something that has kind of coherence and value. And so I wouldn't be at all surprised to see within a couple of years' time some level of convergence, and greater level of convergence than we currently have around what does good corporate level disclosures look like for users of that information. And I think that's probably going to have more of a focus on the investor community as well as downstream customers, rather than the sort of broader set of stakeholders that are currently, I think, reasonably well served by some of those corporate level sustainability reports, but not all of the stakeholder groups feel as well served as they would like to be, I think.
Okay. Alan, can I come to you next?
Yeah, very similar answer. So there's nothing from Aidan which I wouldn't disagree with, so I build on it. I think the other thing which we'll have in 2 years' time is real products in the marketplace. There will be IRMA certified mines. There will be ways of that IRMA certified material being present in the consumer market. Ditto for the ICMM model. That it will be being used. It will exist. So some of the sort of preference debates we've been having today will have had 2 years to settle itself in the real market. I think the other thing is people talk a lot about convergence, and I wonder if that might end up going one stage further, which is actual structural mergers. Because if you've got lots of schemes all being very similar but all funding their own business model, it won't take long for people to realise that there's an inefficiency there. One, there's too much to choose from, and we're all paying lots of salaries for CEOs now lot to run the schemes. So maybe not only will there be convergence against the winning recipe, let's say, they might actually then choose to structurally merge just so they can have a bigger impact. Because there's a lot of mines we've got to hit here. And there's a lot more mining companies who aren't in membership of ICMM. So how do we reach everybody we buy from as ArcelorMittal? And so maybe lesser but bigger organizations might actually solve some of these issues as well. But for me, the big milestone in 2 years' time is real products in the marketplace. And so we can just see what the market prefers as much as what ArcelorMittal might prefer or Alan Knight might prefer. The market will tell us at the end of the day. Yeah.
It's interesting hearing the view on convergence and how that might actually make a lot of sense. I know maybe I'm just a cynic from spending too much time looking at the mining industry, but having multiple CEOs being paid well in multiple organisations isn't normally a recipe for mergers. It's usually the reverse. People try to preserve themselves.
And when you talk to the organisations I'm involved in, you feel the resistance. On the stock market, investors can buy companies and just merge them. You can't do that with this model. So that your pushback is very valid. It might not happen because of the resistance and the inertia within the organisations itself. Unless again the market starts saying, look, there's just too many schemes out there. I can't be members of all of them. They all have to have boards. They all have to have CEOs. And the other thing as well as being a board member of both IRMA and Responsible Steel, the amount of time we talk about convergence and mutual recognition of equivalent schemes, it actually also becomes time consuming as well. To get true convergence is a massive project on teams whose resources are already stretched. So if there were less organizations to converge with and with more people, you would deliver what Aidan's talking about, which is actually performance on the ground. We're devoting a lot of time in this debate about comparing schemes rather than actually using that same resource to how do you get the market to believe in those schemes and how do you drive improvement in the field. Okay. So if you believe in performance, do you believe in all these different schemes? Why don't we just start putting them together?
Okay. Leif, can I come to you next?
Yeah, and can I add to what Alan was saying there? And you talked about earlier on, Alan, you talked about the forestry certification. I think, well, at the moment, we seem to be driving this somewhat as an industry, but also from the financial reporting requirements, from the institutional investment reporting requirements. We are going to see a much greater influence from the consumers in the next 2-3 years. And much like the forestry certification, that's recognisable by many people across the world, even if you aren't actually in the forestry industry, if you're a consumer of forestry materials or products that are made out of forestry materials. And so I think it may be a case of the one that stands most prominent becomes the main certification process or standard, because that is what the consumers will be the go-to one for the consumers. And just a couple of points I wasn't able to come back on earlier. Alan raised an incredibly valid point about the necessity of context for data and having that baseline. And often when we see companies reporting, they're reporting on these are my targets, and then they are reporting on progress. So there's clearly a baseline there, but they're not necessarily giving the context of the current setting and the baseline, especially when they're relatively new targets or new metrics. So that's really critical. And to Lucy's point about the SWAN report on the board makeup, that may well be the fact that we have a low proportion of those who have a sustainability and environmental background on boards, may well be a hangover of how we used to see environmental management and sustainability was all as separate divisions, very much for all of the mining companies and groups was a separate division. You had your environmentalists, you had your environmental scientists, you had your biodiversity specialists, and you had your social specialists, and they were a separate team. What we are seeing now within all of our mining companies is sustainability is being brought into the central core of the operating model, and it is being woven through absolutely every project. So there are metrics for it in every project that's being developed. So that board makeup is very likely to change over the next few years as well.
Okay, and just if I can get you to comment on maybe Aidan and Alan's points on where they would broadly like to see the industry aiming for in 24 months' time. From your perspective as a consultant who it's your job to help the industry improve its best practice and get to these targets, do they feel like reasonable milestones or reasonable target areas to you?
Yeah, they do, definitely. And as I say, the access to the data, to the insights is there. It's a matter of making sure that that's in a consumable format or presentable format. And then, because we have such a broad landscape of the reporting requirements or standards that need to be disclosed to, there's obviously a lot of work there. I'm sure I can speak on behalf of the industry when I say a streamlining of that would be welcomed, for sure. But it is reasonable. It's something that everybody's aware. It's not just a necessity to disclose ESG practice and achievements. It is something that everyone's fully on board, that it's important for our industry. I think the last couple of years have shown that it's actually something we want to do in heart and mind rather than just make money.
Okay. Lucy, sorry, I'm coming to you last. I don't know, has everyone said all the good things to say? Are there
pretty much? Well, yeah, I think the points about convergence of some of these standards is so important because it just becomes so much more usable for industry then, rather than having to pick and choose and sign up to a few different things that are all subtly different. I think from my perspective, within 24 months, it would be fantastic if we can start to see these applying more and more to upstream as well. So earlier on in a company's genesis, when you're still exploring and you're kind of getting to that project development stage, actually, if you can evidence that you have been acting and working with local communities and developing your project to certain standards, I think that would just be fantastic, because at the moment it seems that I know a lot of junior companies are doing great things, but actually it doesn't really kick in that you have to tell people about it until you've actually got a mine. So that's one of the things. And then the other thing is that within 2 years, tapping into what Leith said right at the beginning, there's an amazing amount of data out there now that enables companies to be really transparent with all different groups of stakeholders about what they're doing. So it'd be really great to see companies utilizing this. And I think that also means not just having to do reports every 12 months, 24 months, whatever it is, but actually you can have real-time communication with communities as well. And I think that'll be such a step change in getting this social license to operate and kind of maintaining trust. I think that'd be fantastic.
I do want to move on to something else, but Aidan, very quickly, with the work you're doing, looking across all the different standards that are out there, is there anything like that at the moment that you're seeing in terms of upstream standards? If companies wanted to get on board with the kind of reporting that Lucy's talking about, is there something that they can immediately point to and work towards to disclose?
So again, I've got to emphasize reporting is the end point of a process. Performance is so much more important. But I think, one of the things that we as an organization is kind of almost an article of faith. What we do is public property, and it's there, to try and affect a public good. And so it's all in the public domain. And so we certainly, encourage other organizations beyond our membership. And this has been sort of from the outset, we've said, look, the mining principles are out there. The process for implementation, it's all transparent, it's all publicly accessible. If non-member companies choose to go down that route, then that's fine. It's great. But at least as a starting point, to get a sense of what are the expectations of what good looks like, whether it's what we're doing, what IRMA's doing, or what others are doing. That's a really good place to start. And you're so right. I think quite often, and I know of many upstream companies that are doing really great work, but it's not quite necessarily seeing the light of day, and some incredible lessons are being learned that aren't even being captured. And so if you can give kind of some early thought to what ultimately you might want to be in a position to report and disclose some way down the line, it enables you to put in place the systems and processes to kind of capture that from the get-go without having to retrofit them at a later stage. So I think that's certainly something to maybe keep an eye on.
Okay, so certification and standards, they're already reshaping the industry. And I think it's the hope that they'll create something attractive for future generations of talent that they might like to be involved in the mining industry. It's not just about transparency and moral standing. There are several other things that are going to define the future of the workplace in mining, and how mining companies engage with future employees. Leith, you're probably potentially the best place to look at this from multiple angles. Just keen to understand how you see the workplace changing, maybe a little bit on how it's changed in your view so far, and where you see the really big changes over the next, say, 24 months to 4 years that could potentially reshape how the industry looks to the next generation of employees.
Well, the workplace over the last 4 to 5 years has been changing significantly because we've had this whole digitalisation of the industry, and that's not unique to mining, of course. And as I mentioned earlier, the pandemic has certainly been a further catalyst to that, particularly with moving everyone along their journey towards autonomous operations, so that the plans for autonomous operations have been accelerated in most of the companies that we work with. And that itself has changed the roles that you have within, particularly in operations, but also in the corporate environment, where you might have an organisation that oversees the whole data and analytics piece for each of the business units. So it offers a different set of roles. And whilst many fear that automation will actually decrease the removing workforce, we will get different roles excuse me, available to the next generation, what current generations and the next generations. And very much what we're talking about today in the whole ESG sustainability piece, that itself, as we just talked about, the anticipated change in makeup of boards will open up different roles. where we will have sustainability being considered much more central and core to everything that we do in operations. So one of the key things is it's changing the roles that are available to people in the industry. Two, it's changing the way in which we work. We've moved away from a plan-led approach where you have a list of activities you tick off during the course of your working day or your shift, to receiving insights from data, so situational awareness and also predictive insights that mean you have to make a decision. So you need to be thinking through what's the next best action. And as things are automated, some of that action taking will be automated. A good example of that would be in tailings management. If you have a predictive model showing that you're getting an increase in deformation, for example, in a vulnerable high risk area, that might automatically trigger a drone survey. So that the worker doesn't actually have to make any decision. There's just a notification that threshold has been reached, drone survey automatically instigated, and then the data and insights will be generated for the worker to review. So that's a different mindset and a different way of working. And part of that, and the whole digitalization piece, has created this continuous learning environment, because technology is developing all the time. Every single day we're getting changes in technology. It's really quite incredible. And that means we all need to be keeping on top of what the latest developments are. And even in the operational space where you have machine learning algorithms in place, those need to be continually reviewed, and as more data is coming in, updated. So relearning, the models themselves are relearning. So again, that's a different mindset. So we've got different roles, different ways of working, plus different mindsets, because now we really are in an environment of continuous learning or lifelong learning.
Some of the conversations we have with people, particularly around digitalisation, suggests that the mining industry, true to form, hasn't been as quick on the uptake of this technology as most other sectors. Maybe something in there when you were talking about it's changing every day suggests to me that mining is perhaps starting to catch up, that adapting and adopting with these technologies is something that's becoming more commonplace in mining. I mean, that feels crucial as well to attracting, the best of the next crop of potential employees. Is that true?
That is absolutely true, and it is crucial to attracting your future workforce. It is crucial to realising the value, and I don't mean just monetary value. It could be benefits to stakeholders. So realising the value of any of these initiatives that you're implementing that are leveraging technologies as the tool to deliver on the initiative, and engaging with the workforce in developing those initiatives and implementing those initiatives, whether they're for sustainability or whether they're for productivity or whether they're for safety, is really critical from the outset to ensure that you have ownership by the workforce themselves. You have empowerment of the workforce to be part of that innovation process and designing the new workflows. And then you are more likely to have full adoption and realization of that value. And equally, when you're looking at future workforce, creating an environment that is up with the times and where it should be really, which is where mining is getting to now, is critical for our younger generations, who are all, like anyone Gen Z 25 and under is obviously a digital native, and anyone in the lower half of millennials, so 35 and under, is pretty much a digital native. And so to them, it's critical that if they are going to come into an industry, they join an industry that has the right tools, that the tools that they're used to using at home and have done since they were little kids, like iPads, but also has the right access to information. They are incredibly used to receiving insights on their smartphone or their smartwatch every single day, and getting information around them. So that situational awareness, that you're wandering past your favorite coffee shop and you get a note saying you're going past your favorite coffee shop, maybe not in the pandemic times, but do you need a coffee? They are used to that. And so it's critical that those kind of elements are factored into the industry.
Okay, Lucy, you're the closest thing we've got to a graduate. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Leith's covered some amazing points there. We're moving into the realm of big data in the mining industry now, whether that's through operations or environmental monitoring, or actually even in the exploration space. There's a lot of principles that we can apply from other industries to exploring for these raw materials. Because, in the next few years, if we want to combat climate change, we have to produce a lot of low carbon technologies. To produce a lot of low carbon technologies is going to be hugely resource intensive. We need to mine much more in the next couple of decades than we have done in the few decades past, whether that's copper, whether that's things like lithium. And so this means that we need to be looking in new places as well. And we need to be developing new ways of actually extracting these materials. And actually, if we're going to be extracting them because we want to do positive things for the climate, then we need to make sure we're extracting them responsibly and efficiently and minimizing waste. So there's huge amounts of research that needs to be done into this. And that means I think we need to collaborate a lot more with other industries that are out there that have potentially been more responsive to embracing this big data approach and embracing innovation. And I think that also taps into, I think the future of work's also going to include such things such as life cycle assessments a lot more in project development, project analysis, trying to work out, okay, what is not only the water impact of developing a mine here, but what's going to be the carbon impact of it, what's going to be the social impact on it. And so I think we're going to see more jobs and more roles in the industry that are kind of looking at the holistic impacts of extracting these materials. And again, that's going to involve working with downstream customers of these raw materials. I work in the lithium industry, people who are going to be producing batteries for electric cars. They actually want to know and be able to transparently see all the way up that supply chain and see what those impacts are. And then I think finally, we mentioned that there's a new generation of people that we need to attract to the industry. And I think it's fair to say that climate change is something that is very much on people's agendas now, even maybe more than it was 2 years ago. And what we're seeing from a lot of young people is that they seem to have this perception that the mining industry is quite a dirty place to work. And you can see evidence of that by looking at the number of students who are applying to study geosciences at university. That's been on the decline for at least the last 5 years, whereas actually those wanting to study environmental management has been significantly on the uprise. So we as an industry need to do more to show that actually minerals are going to play a huge role in combating climate change. We need to attract the best and brightest minds to the industry. But we will do that because we've got no choice. And actually, those young people who are coming in, who are so much more aware of their climate impact of using single-use plastic in their daily lives, and I think that phrase tech native is fantastic. So actually, I think we are going to have a younger set of people coming into the industry, and ESG is just going to be so fundamental to what they do anyway. So I think it should be really positive.
Okay, Aidan, I can see you nodding away there. What's the ICMM doing in this particular area?
Yeah, well, just firstly to say that so much of what Liv and Lucy says resonates so strongly, and something that Liv mentioned about COVID-19 is really accelerating trends in this space around automation, digitization, etc. But I guess there's a flip side to this, and that's around vulnerability, because the pandemic has very much laid bare the fact that there are inequities and vulnerabilities in society, and it's triggered this bigger conversation around rebuilding from the pandemic. Even before COVID-19 hit at ICMM, we were looking at a skills for a common future initiative. And that was very much about trying to accelerate national and regional efforts to build new and strengthen existing skills to drive more inclusive economic participation and diversification beyond mining, and really strengthen community resilience. And this is all about recognizing that if you go down this route of digitization, automation, people's livelihoods are at risk. And so if you sleepwalk into that in some respects, absolutely there's going to be winners, but there are going to be losers. And through this initiative, we hope to try and address that, as well as understanding the role that mining can play in recovering from the pandemic. So over the last 6 months, we've convened members to share emerging challenges and early lessons in their response to COVID-19. We've done dozens of video conference calls. And initially the questions were all about how can we improve the immediate response, but then they transitioned into what comes next and how do we prepare for what comes next. And so we published this, what we call a Building Forward Better framework that attempts to respond to those questions. And it very much is about helping not just our members, but all companies have a practical way through to review and strengthen their own responses to the challenges that come with automation and digitization, and then the wider community as well as their own workforce. And the focus is really about mining's role in supporting long-term community resilience. And it draws on industry experience to help users evaluate the challenges and the opportunities for businesses to really build forward better, whether that's to do with damage wrought by the pandemic or whether it's to do with the changes that will come about through digitization and automation. And it focuses on 3 areas for action: lives, which is all about health and safety; livelihoods, all about jobs and income; and then also learning, which is very much in the education and skills space. And within those areas, there's more than 90 actions that are suggested that companies can take, illustrated by over 60 examples from across the sector. So we see this as being so important in terms of the future of work in this sector.
Okay, and I'm very conscious of time. I know some of you need to get off very quickly. Can we just, in the last couple of minutes, maybe come back to you, Lucy, to start with? Just very briefly, if we're saying that at the moment, as Lucy suggests, the industry is seen by younger generations still largely as something that's we're plunderers of the earth, etc., etc. Are we moving in the right direction? Do we think we're going to be in a better place in 2 years? Do we think we're going to be in a much better place in 2 years? Are we going to transform this view within 2 years on our current trajectory? Or does something massive need to change? Come back to you, Lucy, to start.
That's such a difficult one. I think, to be honest, a lot of people, especially in the UK and Europe, just don't actually think about mining. It doesn't necessarily happen here. It's not on people's radars, and it doesn't occur to them to question where their mobile phone has come from. So maybe that apathy is actually potentially even worse than the people who are quite strongly opposed to it. And I think historically, the mining industry has been quite wary of engaging with people outside of our kind of immediate bubble. So when members of the public hear about the mining industry, it's because there's been a tailings dam collapse or someone's blown up some Aboriginal sacred place. And, you know, it's always these negative stories that make the news. So maybe we kind of need a two-pronged approach. We need to find a way of actually actively, proactively engaging with not just the stakeholders around our projects, but wider communities. And some of that can come down to actually utilizing all this data we've got about how the mining industry is behaving and things that people are doing that are really positive. But I do think we need to be proactive about it, because at the moment we're just kind of going along as we always have done. But it's not easy to reach parts of society that you haven't traditionally engaged with. And exactly what the answer is to that, I'm not sure. There's a lot of initiatives out there at the moment, especially in the UK, that are kind of looking at that. One of them is Future Geo, which is talking about the future of geoscience. And, you know, I think the first conference for that was held virtually back in June, and I think there are about 3,500 or 4,000 people logged on, all discussing what is the image problem that geoscience has, how do we encourage more young people into the industry, how do we engage with stakeholders who haven't necessarily even thought about us before. And there are similar initiatives going on across Europe, but what exactly the answer is, I'm not sure.
Okay, Lee, I'll come to you next. I'm not taking a huge amount of optimism from Lucy there. I don't know if you
I'm not sure. There are ways to fix it, but I think it might take more than 2 years. I think things have to change significantly. We need increased diversity. That will make a massive difference. We also need to change our attitude towards leadership. where mining has very traditionally been hierarchical in leadership, and the older you are and the more grey hairs you are, the more senior you are, and the more you have airtime and a voice. And actually, I'd quite like to see some super young people sitting, even if it was just in a slightly reduced capacity, but have some really young people on the board of some of our junior, mid-tier and major mining companies. Because I think you have leaders at every single stage of life and every single age. And it's a bit like voting for government. The opinion of a 22-year-old counts equally as much as the opinion of a 65-year-old. And I think we need to actually have that diversity of age in leadership, and more role models across the board.
Okay, Aidan.
Yeah, I would echo everything that's been said. I think, I'm an incurable optimist by nature, so I think we absolutely can. But I happen to agree with Liv. I think it's going to take a little bit of time. But I'm hugely encouraged by the talent that I see coming into this industry. And this is, to Liv's point again, it's an incredibly diverse group of professionals that I have the privilege of interacting with, kind of across geographies and across across age brackets. But I do think that in some respects, the industry of the future, as digitization, automation takes hold, that in ways is going to level that playing field and create greater opportunity if we get it right and encourage greater diversity into the industry. I think we have a structural problem insofar as historically we've been incredibly good at just dispensing with the services of way too many people in times of a downturn in a way that's made it unattractive for people to have a long-term sustained commitment to stay with this industry. I think we've got to fix that, because if we don't fix that, we will continue to hemorrhage people and good people from the industry. So I'm an optimist, but I don't think it's going to happen through some invisible hand. It's got to be some really smart thinking brought to bear and some really great work done to help make it happen. So again, I'm encouraged by the people on this call in terms of helping to take us in that direction.
Okay, Alan, I know it's not your pet subject, but can I prize an opinion out of you?
I'm an optimist too, because I think the other thing as well, which I'm seeing, is we talk about, the youngsters of today and the new graduates, but we've got the high flyers who were only graduates 10 years ago. They joined with that religion, and I'm seeing it already in the companies I work for and work with, that the high flyers in the early 30s who are getting to very senior positions, there's no resistance to this ESG agenda or a diversity agenda. So let's not just get very bipolar and say it's the graduates of today will make the difference. It's the graduates of 10 years ago who are already making a difference, particularly those who are just climbing the ladder really quickly because they're good. So that's why I would put my flag on the optimism hill, because yesterday's graduates, the high flyers, are making this agenda easier and more palatable to talk at board level than it was when I started in the 90s.
Okay. I'd like to add, I'm definitely an optimist.
Yeah.
I think there's even so. I've only been in the mining industry for 7 years now, and there's been so much change in that time. And these kind of conversations weren't even happening on such a scale 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah. So there is definitely change happening.
Thanks, Lucy. So we're not just out of time, we're now over time. So I'll let you all go. Lucy Crane, Leif Carroll, Aidan Davey, Alan Knight, thank you very much for joining us. It's been fascinating.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Yeah, thanks,
Chris.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye. Bye.